Greg Ardé has written an explosive new book on the intersection of criminal networks, politicians, police and KwaZulu-Natal. The book shows how the ANC's cadre deployment has inextricably entwined the ruling party and the state. In KwaZulu-Natal, that is, and the party's powerhouse province, IFP-ANC warfare has morphed into an internal ANC battle that has created a monster of competing patronage networks. For more, we're joined by the author, Greg, on the line. Greg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nastasia. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
So what inspired you to write this book, especially at this particular time?
Well, the killings just carried on in KZN. I spent my formative years as a journalist covering political violence in KZN, and the killings abated mercifully, and then they started up again, and they transformed from what analysts called warfare to intra-party violence, whereas previously it would be conventionally between the ANC and the IFP, for example, it became ANC members killing one another. And I was just fascinated by how this was playing out and, like others, deeply troubled by it.
Talk to me about the process of putting the book together. I mean, you went at great length in the beginning of the book to talk to some of the families who were affected by some of the killings that have taken place in KZN.
Yeah, there was a really interesting commission of inquiry. People are quite cynical, and rightly so, about the number of commissions of inquiries we've had in South Africa. But in KZN, there was a commission conducted by, the chairman was an advocate Morani. And it was an interesting exercise. It was quite criticized because of the cost involved and the fact that the recommendations at the end of a year or something were described as quite bland. But within the Morani Commission, there was some really heart-wrenching tales. And I wanted to know more, so I connected with the families of the people who had been killed. And it's just so the Morani Commission honed in on some of the political killings, and I tried to take those further. And it was really heartbreaking. So it was, political violence. It's a sort of a numb term that doesn't mean anything. But if you mind the individual stories, it's about people's families and that are completely devastated by the murders that are really conducted or motivated by greed and corruption. And that's what I tried to mine.
Let's talk about what you found interesting when it comes to the killings in Newcastle and perhaps how they may be different to some of the killings we saw in Dundee. Perhaps you can take us through some of those.
Newcastle was, once the poster child for industrialized apartheid South Africa, I suppose. One of the towns that sort of was said to have done so well through industrialization, and it's a generally prosperous town, halfway between Joburg and Durban, and then you have a situation where the mayor is held up in court, and there's a string of murders, and the mayor is in court, and then there's a whole cast of other characters that are really interesting there, and another mayor who leaves to go, his predecessor leaves to go to Dubai, and yeah, it was just a little town that was just infested with corruption, and it was kind of like representative of what's happening in many other towns in KZN. So I didn't think it was so unique, but for the characters in the story.
When it comes to, the justice for some of the victims, I mean, the one particular story that you talked about that really caught my attention was an incident where one of the members was gunned down back in the 90s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But his son seemed to have forgiven the killers who basically were responsible for his father's, murder. And he basically goes on to say, he had now accepted the ANC, he had forgiven them. And did that strike you as a bit strange that somebody who had experienced such terrible loss, especially as a young boy, to have just, looked the other way, considering what some of these members had done to his family and the pain that they had caused?
I found that story astounding. I covered the violence in Richmond years ago, and it was real mayhem. So I revisited the story, and Sifiso Nkabinde, he told me and other journalists, I've got a bullet with my name on it. So he's totally predicted his demise. So then, fast forward 20 years, and so you couldn't go into Richmond 20 years ago. You'd have to go with an armed escort, and you'd have to go with the army or the police, and it was really tense. And then Sifiso Nkabinde was murdered after a host of other murders, many of which were pinned on him, although he was acquitted. But it was his people. So I go back 20 years later and visit his family, and it's incredibly peaceful. And I speak to his mom, and the young Vic Nkabinde is a really charming young man, and his mom. And they were really pragmatic about it. They said, you can't get on in life if you don't acknowledge the ANC and its power. And if you're ostracized, if you're not with the ANC, there's really very little chance of getting by. And he did, genuinely seems to have embraced his father's killers just because he wanted to move on psychologically and didn't want to sort of be angry for the rest of his life. There's seemed to me so many positive and sort of like redeeming aspects to that story. But what I found so curious is that some of his dad's killers are now employed by the ANC. They go to prison and then they looked after in prison, and then they leave prison, and then they're given jobs back in the town that they where they committed this murder. And there's a family called the Ndabazita family, and they were the victims of an awful massacre. And they took to social media sort of just a couple of months before I published the book, and they said, wow, if you're not linked to the ANC, then you don't get anything. But if you are linked to the ANC, clearly you benefit. And that story was kind of typical of the stories that I unpacked in the book. Sorry, I think I rambled a bit there, Mr. Seth.
Greg, thank you so much for your time. That's Greg Ardé talking about his new book titled War Party, How the ANC's Political Killings Are Breaking South Africa. That's it from me. I'll be back next week with The Alternative Investor, but goodbye for now.